Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this webinar on what is disaster recovery. My name is Amanda Leck, and I'm the Executive Director of the Australian Institute for Disaster Recovery. It is my pleasure to be the host of today's webinar. This is the first webinar of AIDA's new Recovery Matters webinar series, which we've set up to share knowledge and good practice for disaster recovery in the wake of our devastating bushfire season. We know that recovery is a long journey, and over the coming months, we will bring in a range of guest speakers with different recovery expertise to share what they know to help us support communities to recover. Today, we have two guest speakers who I'll introduce shortly, but first I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. Here in Melbourne, where AIDA is based, that is the Wurundjeri people, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge that this could be quite a sensitive and emotional issue for many people. If this discussion does raise anything for you, I do encourage you to seek adequate support from organisations such as Lifeline or Beyond Blue. So we'll now turn to John Richardson. John is the National Resilience Advisor for Australian Red Cross. He is also an honorary fellow of the University of Melbourne with the Beyond Bushfires Research Project. He has 23 years experience in recovery in government and NGO settings. So please welcome John, and thank you, John.
Thanks, Amanda, and thanks everyone for joining. So thanks for taking the time out of your busy days today in these challenging times to join us in what I think is going to be a bit of a whirlwind tour of recovery. Thanks to AIDA for hosting this, and particularly Amanda and Melissa for putting it on, getting it organised. And also I'd like to acknowledge Louise Mitchell, who seeded the idea. Recovery is not a dark art, and I hope what you'll see is it's mainly common sense and draws upon a lot of stuff that we already do and know. The other thing is it's always also been around for decades, and there are plenty of resources out there to help people who have possibly been through some of the worst days of their lives. So between Kirsten and I, we hope to introduce you to some of these resources and give you some insights into some of our experience. I'll try and cover off in the next 15 minutes what happens to people, how people respond, and how we manage. Before I move on, I'd also like to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people, elders past, present, and emerging, and also to respect the knowledge that has been accumulated by the world's oldest living culture, where there's 60,000 years of living with flood, fire, earthquake, volcanic eruptions, disease and dispossession. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from our First Nations people. I realise I'm not actually doing... Apologies, I'm rattled on, so and without realising that I'm not moving the slide. So apologies for everyone out there. So yes, acknowledge traditional owners of the land. What I will also say is that this session normally takes anywhere between 2 and 4 hours to deliver. So to do it in 15 minutes, I suggest strap yourselves in as we hit jump to light speed. Context is very much the key, and I think what we've got to recognise is while we talk about recovery being the fourth stage in the emergency management continuum, it doesn't occur in isolation. Development 101, which many of us are familiar with, suggests that people live in places that they probably shouldn't, and that disadvantage is a key challenge. People don't necessarily have the financial resources to move out of harm's way, or according to Helen Boone's excellent paper, which is in AGEM, undertake preparedness measures and afford assurance. And of course afterwards be able to afford and access the recovery measures as well. And while we sometimes think that, well, this happens over there somewhere, I can also recommend Tom Doig's excellent book, The Coalface, which is about the Morwell open cut fire. And this brings this issue into sharp relief within the Australian context. This quote is about 50 years old from Russell Dines, and I think it's still really relevant. And what I take out of this is that we've got to recognise that communities do stuff every day of the week, and so there's a whole bunch of stuff happening. They go about their business. There are people doing good things. There are people doing bad things. They're struggling to get by. They're cruising along in life. They might be caring. They're not caring, or prioritising things, or not prioritising things. So we need to recognise this as part of the contextual piece. And as the Australian vulnerability profile suggests, they're supported by really complex and silent systems, or systems of systems, that basically make our lives work. And what we're actually seeing at the moment with the pandemic is that those systems are now coming to the fore. So what this does is it gives us access to high quality, safe goods and services. It gives us access also to they're affordable. It provides enjoyable life experiences for us, and provides an economic return on investment for businesses. Again, that's the context in which we are also dealing with. Now, again, that's not evenly spread across the country, and in different places that might be different. But as an economically advanced nation, this is what we aspire to. So with that as a context, we then move into the hazard intersecting with a vulnerable community, classic definition from Enrico Quarantelli, and really want to talk about the human impacts. They are wide but interlinked. Each of them cross over, and from much what I'm going to draw upon here is research that we've conducted with the University of Melbourne after the Black Saturday bushfires, a thing called the Beyond Bushfire Study. Because it's comprehensive and it's available to us and relevant. So we see challenges with health, changes in physical health, mental health, shifts in people's well-being. They're an increasingly described phenomenon called post-traumatic growth. We know that chronic illnesses may increase. For example, in the earthquake in Wencheng in China, 3 years afterwards, there was an increase by 39% of presentations of chronic illnesses. Most people experience some form of stress during and immediately after the emergency. This is a normal reaction to an abnormal event, and we believe 80% of people will genuinely manage these issues with the support of their families and friends. But that means that 20% will need some form of formal assistance. Diagnosable conditions such as post-traumatic stress, depression, anxiety do occur. And this is borne out with the Black Saturday bushfires study, where we found that at least a quarter to a fifth of people between 3 and 5 years after Black Saturday were still experiencing diagnosable mental health conditions. But then the other thing is that people often feel that and they report they feel terrible, but they actually don't have a diagnosable condition. And so this is captured more by people's self-reported well-being measures. And in New Zealand, the Canterbury Earthquake Authority ran a well-being index that measures people's well-beings at a 6-monthly interval after the earthquake. And again, they found there that generally well-being was okay, except for if you were considered to be in a vulnerable group or you were in temporary accommodation. So then there was quite significant drops in well-being. So this is actually quite an important thing when you're actually talking with people, because they may not have a diagnosis, but they are feeling terrible, and we can talk about it in those terms. There's challenges to relationships. They form, they break up, and they experience violence. The disaster is an accelerator of things that was going to happen anyway, is what the research tends to suggest. And sadly, the post-disaster space is also where women and children often do not feel safe and experience violence. It happens here in this country, as the team from the Gender and Disaster Pod have demonstrated after the Black Saturday bushfires with some excellent research, as well as that's been supported by some findings that we found at the University of Melbourne, which indicates that at least 7% of women experience some form of violence, and this has contributed to their post-traumatic stress. There's also challenges with housing, where we see temporary accommodation is associated with lower rates of well-being. Relocation away from affected areas can have both its benefits and its challenges. Rebuilding rates are slow, and that is an entirely normal thing. We saw in Canberra in the first year after the bushfires in 2003, around about 10% of homes were rebuilt. this is not because they couldn't rebuild. This is about people's decisions and then not being able to make decisions about what they want to do. The challenge with that is that rebuilding is actually often seen as our KPI in recovery, and so people latch onto it, and so that is something that we need to be really mindful of. We also need to be mindful of children's academic performances, and we've seen again with Black Saturday some good research done there, which I think we will look at in another session. That indicates that yes, there are impacts on kids' academic performances. We know there's also impacts on people's income as well, and great research out of Deakin University found that there's a drop in income after the fires, particularly in retail and tourism, although conversely in health and building, income rates went up. But unfortunately, not surprising, but worryingly, that it's actually worse for women than men. And finally, grief and loss. So the challenge around grief and loss is we have this sort of hierarchy of grief where people sort of tend to focus on those who have lost loved ones, quite importantly, but there's a whole range of losses that people experience, whether it's environment, whether it's the loss of their home, pets, things that they have grown up with, and that can also have significant impact on people. So a range of sort of human impacts, really just touched on them there. We could talk about that for a lot longer, but we won't. Just to be really mindful that all of these have a cost, and what we know through work that's been done with Australian Business Roundtable is the social costs are equal to, if not greater than, the physical costs of rebuilding roads and bridges. We also must recognise that there are certain groups of people who are overrepresented in the disaster statistics, and again, we all realise that elderly, people with disability, people might be newly arrived, LGBTQI, so communities may have different and significant impacts, but we've also got to recognise that they have capacity as well, and recognise what it is that is actually contributing to their issues. So I'll now sort of touch briefly on human responses. How do people react? Well, basically differently. So there's no one size fits all. There's no one way of recovering. People all have different experiences of everything, and importantly, there are no time frames. That wasn't supposed to do what I was going to do. So anyway, so people may have seen this curve, which is where we see the heroic honeymoon and disillusionment phase. And so that's a very nice sort of kind of linear curve. But this one I found, which was from a paper in New Zealand, which I think is probably represented a lot more on people's journeys, which is effectively a bit bumpy. So we'll see anger, frustration, laughter, tiredness, sadness, crying, grief, joy, happiness, and sometimes all at once, or if it's not all at once, it might be within a very short time frame. So this is how we kind of see people go through this. And again, don't like to necessarily put timelines on this, because people might look at that and say, well, you should be in honeymoon now, and you're not. So we need to be really, really careful of that. But just to give us a sense of where we're going through, and I would suggest with fire-affected communities, and we know that they're all at different stages when you think about the spread across the country, but we're probably all sort of heading into the sort of disillusionment sort of phase. So what happens to people? Stress is a really a key sort of factor here in disaster recovery. And it's a natural thing. It's a body's way of getting energy to work outside the normal comfort zone. It's caused by a range of stressors, which can be positive or negative. It can help us, it can motivate us. It helps us get things done, get things across the line. But it can also be cumulative, and this is what we see in recovery. And cumulative stress occurs when sort of all the little things that we do, we don't let go of, build up, and that can have an impact on us. And so what that means is that people may have different reactions, and we've got the sort of 6 different sort of areas there. So cognitive reaction might be poor memory and concentration. aka bushfire brain, which a lot of people sort of talk about after Black Saturday. The physical reactions, which are around dizziness, sweating, and nausea, behavioural reactions, which could include anything from change behaviours or restlessness or apathy. We see emotional reactions. That can be anything from people acting quite sort of differently, whether it's excited or depressed or get really sort of easily hurt. The social reactions, which sort of include withdrawal from relationships or change in relationships with people and institutions. And then finally, the existential challenges or reactions, where people actually really question what it is as they've been through and how it's affecting them. And so what happens in communities then? And we see a range of things where, again, people are facing the structures that they're familiar with and the environment that they're familiar with has changed, and this affects the mental map that they draw about their communities, and that can be quite disorienting. What it does is also lose people's ability to go about their sort of daily things. So places greater stress on. If you do not have a school, you do not have a store or a supermarket, then that changes things. And it also prevents people's ability to meet, and that's really, again, is important in the post-disaster environment. But we also see the social capital come to the fore, and this is the work that Daniel Aldrich from the US has done, and where social capital is a really important resource for people to draw upon. And then finally, the processes that go on in community change, and what we do see is where people initially come together in what Rob Gordon calls the sort of fusion state. This is pretty much what the feel-good stories that we see in the media, and everyone works together and things look wonderful. However, when they start to think about what the future might mean, and potentially like the old divisions will start to sort of come to the fore again, and we need to be mindful of that. So I'll run along to the recovery system and what does recovery actually mean. Now, it's a really complex system, and again, we tended to have seen it over many years as a fairly linear thing, but as you can sort of see here with using the London Underground, it's actually quite sort of complex, and there are many inputs, and there are many, and all will have sort of well-being impacts. There's no one journey and no one outcome. And really, the way we like to sort of think about it is all recovery is psychosocial and personal. So, a couple of things I really like to talk about is, recovery is more than the basics. So it's more than providing food, water, shelter. Obviously really important and needs to be done, but we need to sort of recognise that, so again, going back to the contextual piece, people have aspirations, they have lives that they seek to live, communities need to be prosperous, and so we need to be thinking about recovery planning in that particular way and our responses in that particular way. The challenge with recovery is it's not easy to define, and so we've used the UN definition in the Community Recovery Handbook, and that's a really terrific technocratic definition that we can use with bureaucrats and others, but stand up in front of a community meeting and talk about recovery as this definition. It'll be challenging. You may not make it out of the room. Hence, we, like Anne Leadbeater, who from Kinglake's definition, and people will probably be aware of Anne, and it's really about a person-centred approach and definition and a values-based definition. So we think that this helps centre what we're actually wanting to do. We also strongly focus on community-led recovery, and again, I won't talk about this too much because this is something that we're again, another seminar we'll look at, But just being really mindful of that, people are in control of their destinies, and they need to be, and we don't want to sort of see that taken away from them, but it quite often is under the guise of, well, it's been a disaster and you don't know what you don't know what you want, so we're here to help you. So absolutely need to be mindful that it needs to be person-centred and community-led. Recovery is long-term. It's a marathon and not a sprint. And we saw with, Ken talked about Black Saturday bushfires, and I spoke about that, but the research from the University of Melbourne spoke about recovery programming needs to be for 5 years. And you sort of see some of these news articles from the ABC 10 years after events, and people are still hurting. So we need to be mindful that that's a long-term approach. Recovery programming is really sort of first and foremost is about doing no harm. We need to be really mindful of that. We need to take a sort of strengths focus. It needs to be sort of people-centred, demand-driven, inclusive, making sure we leave nobody behind. Long-term, as I mentioned, using networks and existing resources, planning strategically and dynamically. We can't just do one strategic plan and hope for the best for the 5 years. And we've got to learn. So really sort of look at monitoring and evaluation. I'll briefly touch on a couple of things I just want to talk about. So around recovery, so politics is a really sort of key challenge, and politicians are the representatives of their communities. They will also be affected by the events that they've been through. They will be confronted, and they may not have the skills or training to sort of deal with those who are traumatised, but they often make promises, and those promises people will hold them to. We need to be really mindful of the media, and we've all seen this over summer as well, and we're seeing it now with the COVID-19. It's going to shape the narrative, and there's some great work that was done out of University of Melbourne by Dennis Muller after Black Saturday, which sort of talks about the challenges in media and really important. So again, I won't run through these in detail. But really, I think one of our challenges is that the recovery stories are often quite hard to sell, and so we need to be able to provide media outlets with content that demonstrates sort of what's happening in the community. Goodwill, I usually say here, stay well away from it and run from the room screaming if somebody asks you to manage this. But we have to be mindful that people want to contribute, they want to help, and disaster provokes sort of really powerful images, and that sort of prompts people to want to help. Again, there's some good guidance out there around how to sort of manage both spontaneous volunteers and donated goods, so we need to be really mindful of this. And very, very quickly, I just want to flag, it's also natural to want to commemorate what has happened. Even if there have been no deaths, there's quite often a strong community desire to commemorate. I won't say much more other than there's a Community Recovery Handbook, which is terrific, and there are national principles of disaster recovery, which are really good. They set the context. I'll talk about the guidelines of minimum standards that Red Cross have for protection, genuine inclusion. This is the sort of framework that we use. Again, helps with programming so that we don't leave people behind. Work that we're doing at the University of Melbourne is on what's called the recovery capitals. As people will know or may know the sort of propeller model, which has the 4 environments of recovery. The work that's currently going on at the Uni of Melbourne with Massey University is looking at expanding that out to 6 and sort of looking at what some tools that can be developed there to support people. There's a monitoring and evaluation framework for recovery, and this is a really good piece of work. It's quite complex, and I recognise the complexity of recovery. Certainly to be recommended. And that's it. We're back out of light speed.
Thank you very much, John. That was very insightful. I appreciate that you whizzed through some of this for participants, but it was this is focused on an introduction to recovery. Some of the concepts John spoke to will be the subject of future webinars, so we hope you'll join us for those. I'd like to now introduce Kirsten Jenkins, the Manager Health, Local Laws and Emergency Management at Maroondah City Council. Kirsten has worked at councils in both rural and metro areas and was the bushfire recovery coordinator with Nillumbik Shire after the February 2009 bushfires. Welcome, Kirsten.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. So my name's Kirsten. I currently work at Maroondah Council. What I wanted to talk to you guys about today was really about my experience from a local government perspective. And I imagine there's lots of people listening who don't work at local government, but I was the bushfire recovery coordinator for 3 years or so after the 2009 bushfires. I think local government has a complex relationship with community, and if we often talk about roads, rates and rubbish, but in emergency management we're a lot more than that, and I think we struggle to find our place in our emergency management arrangements along with the lights and sirens. Can sometimes be a vexed relationship with community. There's a lot of, council, we don't like council, what have they got to do with this? And really in the heat of the disaster, trying to build those links and that trust with communities is a really an important and complex process. We are in it for the long term. Local government is around long after the media has gone away, long after the funding announcements and everything has been put into place. And we have this vast and varied service delivery for all sorts of touch points with our community. And I think we just really need to understand our importance in that role. I like this be like a duck. Often, we're running around, it's chaotic to begin with, and we need to stay calm, show ourselves as leaders in crisis, and, behind the scenes, everyone's flurrying around. I think that it's really hard to manage that everybody wants to help. You have a structure within your organisation that says this person's a municipal recovery manager and that person's the EM manager, and then all of a sudden the disaster hits and everybody wants to help. I suppose my tips are really around showing that you're the leader in the organisation when it comes to recovery, but being able to let go of what you're doing and delegate and bring in the cavalry, bring in the help. Often we get really attached to what we're doing, and we feel like we don't want to let it go. And I'll refer back to John's comments, which is really around this cumulative stress and that it's a marathon and not a sprint, and we find we do all of this work in the early stages, and then we realise that this is going to go on for a really long time. And I think looking after yourself is one of the most important things that we can do. It can be frantic and chaotic and stressful, and it can also, provide a life-changing experience for you in your career. And all of a sudden, you've gone from doing your day job at the council and you're being involved in a really amazing experience working with communities and helping them on their recovery journey. You can be part facilitator, doer, administrator, teacher, listener, all sorts of things, mediator, negotiator, and that becomes your role in trying to manage some of that recovery, the recovery process from local government. And I just wanted to make a comment around leadership coming in all forms. So often the quietest of the community members are the ones that step up in a crisis, It can be, lower banding levels at council. It doesn't necessarily just have to be the CEO or the managers that are leaders in a crisis. It can be anyone in the organisation can step up to the mark and start, really flourishing in this experience. So I suppose I just wanted to really make some brief comments on, who is the community. It can change. We could talk, all day about who is in the community, and what it is and who comprises of it. And as a local government agency or a local organisation, you'll have a really good understanding of your community and some of the nuances that are there. Making connections early in the piece and building trust is really important. Like I said before, councils can have quite a vexed relationship with community from the outside. But, we have youth workers, we have community development workers, we have land care facilitators. We have all of these people who are out and about working in our communities every day, and we need to use their skills and expertise to really make those connections with our community. I suppose just in normal, we expect the unexpected. There's always announcements, there's always things that take you by surprise, and it's just about kind of going along for the ride. One of the things I found as a recovery manager really was around trying to manage this outcomes versus process. So as a council bureaucrat, often you're used to doing things in a particular way, or there's a legislative requirement, means that you have to fill out that form. And it's really about understanding, working with the community and saying, well, we can get the same outcome, and if I don't have to make them go through this particular process, and we can get the same outcome, then why don't we do that? And sometimes that's quite hard to advocate for, within your organisation. There's always a goalpost. There's always a goalpost that changes. We think we have our emergency management arrangement set, and then the next thing, a new organisation is established by the state government, or a new funding arrangement, or something else will happen. And really, it's about trying to take stock of those things and manage that. And then, there's the system. The journey to recovery is a system about community-led recovery, about planning with community, about ensuring they're involved in the decision-making, and then sometimes all we need to do is have a piece of paper that says community recovery plan. So what does that mean? And that really that really sort of heads back to John's conversation around it has to be dynamic, it has to be strategic and dynamic, but something that shows the community that we are listening to what their needs are, and that there's a plan in place for things that we can be addressed. And there's always unrealistic deadlines that you as a local government agency or as another organisation really take on an advocacy role for your community when, maybe there's an announcement that says, if the Community Recovery Committee would like funding for such and such, they need to have an application done by, next Monday. And really trying to work through what those timelines are or deadlines, and that community recovery doesn't finish on the 30th of June. They're the sorts of things that as that kind of recovery manager and that the bureaucracy in that is trying to support our communities to work through. So, in hindsight's always great. I noticed that, there are a few people that are just relatively new in the recovery space. If I had the time over again, I think that there's an opportunity to really understand the responsibilities of the council or your organisation in your state emergency management and recovery arrangements. So what are they? In Victoria, we have the Emergency Management Manual of Victoria. It lists all of the responsibilities of all the agencies and authorities. Having an understanding of where you fit, because when those goalposts do change or those expectations of your organisation change, you have the ability to say, well, that's not what we're supposed to be doing. This is how we want to do it, and really have that background evidence to support your case, I suppose. Attending forums and regional meetings and training and scenario exercises is really important. It builds up your relationships with other people in the same positions. It builds up your relationships with people in neighbouring councils or organisations. Gives you someone to call on if, you know, when you do find yourself in the middle of a disaster, that you have friends and mentors and supporters that you can just ring and ask questions for. This is really important. You know, and I think learning about people's reactions to disasters is really important. So what does cumulative stress mean? What does vicarious trauma mean? How is my community going to, you know, respond in this process, and what does that mean for me as a person if I'm dealing with these people? And that doesn't mean everyone has to be a psychologist or have a psychology degree, but it's really about, you know, understanding where they're coming from and what they might be going through. And I think council workers in particular have, you know, we have lots of difficult conversations with our residents about different things, and we understand people's responses. And this is just taking it a bit to another level in terms of understanding the trauma that's behind how they might be reacting to whatever's going on. And I've written here Recovery Planning 101, and that's really just around understanding the recovery arrangements, the importance of so, for example, in 2009, we had 4 environments for recovery. It's you know, based on the environments for health, which is your natural, social, built, and economic. They change in different states, and sort of had a bit of a workaround in Victoria recently. But really understanding the interactions between each of those areas, and as a council, what that means. So, from a rebuilding perspective, from an economic development to support small business, for a land care, environmental recovery, just having an understanding of some of that theory is really important. So, yeah, that's pretty easy, right? And we've all got plenty of time to do all of this with our normal jobs. But I think that comes back to when you find yourself in the middle of a disaster, you have relationships and other people you can call on, and you can certainly you know, ask people for help when you need it. And just in closing, really, I think as you know, as a disaster worker, the recognising the signs of stress in yourself and your colleagues is really important. I've always made the comment that people in local government don't work for local government to be overseas aid workers, but they suddenly find themselves responding in the middle of a disaster. And I think we have work to do as organisations to ensure we have employee assistance programs and staff welfare programs, and that supervising and understanding what those staff members might be going through, and also that their own community is affected. Often people who work at local government live in the area or might have people who know people who are affected, and that's a really important thing that we need to have an awareness of. I think valuing, acknowledging your own reactions. You know, from a personal experience, I always felt like, oh, I feel terrible, you know, like I feel really stressed and I'm really cross about this, but not acknowledging that, because I always felt guilty that I wasn't the one that left, you know, I didn't lose my house, or I wasn't involved in the disaster. But I think it's really important when you're working in that space to acknowledge that they're really valid reactions. It's a marathon, not a sprint, as John has said, and I think with all recovery and all stressful situations, you know, communication is really important. The communication with your supervisors, communication with the community is something that we need to look at. And when you look at the up and down graph that John had, everyone recovers at different times and has the ability to hear things and take things in at different times. And so those communication methods have to be in different ways at different times and in different formats for people to understand that. And that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. We really appreciate that. And we've had lots of terrific questions come online. So we've got about 15 minutes for a Q&A. So we've been through the questions, and we've selected some that we're going to pose to John and Kirsten. So firstly, from Kimberly D, how can we improve temporary emergency housing to lessen the stress on the affected residents? I'll ask you, John.
Yeah, sure. And Kirsten, jump in as well too, please. Look, I think, this is a really challenging one, and what we do see, I think where the stress arises is the sort of really short-term nature of accommodation. So we really should be looking at if we are able to provide people with long-term, short-term options. I know that sounds a bit silly, but the idea is really trying to reduce the kind of uncertainty and sort of the stress around moving. So again, ideally, you go back to pre-disaster, and ideally that's where your planning should address that. But really, in sort of post-disaster environments, so looking for sort of longer-term options that are certainly appropriate for people's circumstances, families, and that sort of thing. Kirsten, is that any thoughts that you have?
Yeah, no, I think one of the important things too is when people are displaced, it's about still facilitating the connection to their community as well. So, after Black Saturday, we had a lot of people that moved interstate, but I think it's that communication process and knowing where people are, and even if they're not in the same suburb, they're the one over, they're still invited to social activities, they're still, they still have, that communication about what's going on in their community so they can still feel part of it. I think that's really important in that displacement, in that feeling of displacement.
Okay. In the interest of time, we've got lots of questions, so I'll keep going. So Peter H. asks, why can't we tell the truth about recovery? If a person does not have insurance, then there is no money available to them to be able to recover themselves.
Yeah, look, that's a great question. And we do see that that quite often, that sort of question. But I think, again, it's not a simple situation. So there's a notion that people choose not to have insurance. Some people do. They tend to be younger. But quite often we find issues around insurance is that people may be underinsured or they may be fully insured, and then you find that there are greater building standards afterwards, so there is a gap there. Or a situation I recall once where we provided assistance to a woman who was an elderly woman whose husband had passed away 12 months before. Now, her husband did all of the renewals and everything, and so the insurance just wasn't renewed. And she lost her roof in a storm, was not insured, and then spent, I think, eight months with a tarpaulin on the roof because she was too frightened to ask anyone for help. So I think it is a difficult one, but equally we are also, we do have I think a sort of a catch-all safety net in this country, and that's sort of what makes us, a modern, advanced nation.
Thanks, John. So Gillian E. has asked, is it time to move on from recovery or recovered and move to restored? So restore wellbeing, livelihoods, connections, community. What's your thoughts on that?
Kirsten, do you want to take that one first, or
no?
I'm happy to. But I don't want to kind of dominate it. I'll just
No, I mean, you can go. My only comment is, I agree, and I think in my experience, I've had communities that have called themselves community renewal associations. Some have called themselves community recovery, and I think it's whatever words mean the most, and that's what and I think there is always this opportunity for this sort of bureaucratic speak or other words that we use that don't mean anything to community, and it's our role to kind of be able to interpret it for them. But I'll pass it over to you, John.
Yeah, look, I would say the same thing. I think they're words. Recovery has been a term that's been around for a while. I wouldn't be wedded to it. I think restored would suggest that you're reaching you're reaching kind of a previous standard, doesn't necessarily incorporate sort of build back better. So I think there's probably, again, depending on sort of the conversations that you have in communities, you really sort of be needing to sort of think about that as an issue.
Okay, so there is one on building back better. Do you know what the appetite is? Carla asks, do you know what the appetite is for those who are impacted by disasters to be thinking about building back better and other long-term resilience measures? It's hard to know when or how to start talking about this. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Look, again, that's a really interesting one because, we do talk a lot about building back better, and then sort of invariably then there's a news article of somebody who's really annoyed because there's been new bushfire building regulations imposed on them, and it's going to cost them more money, and this is outrageous, and what is the government doing about it? So you do see that as part of the tension, but I think as Kirsten said, and I sort of alluded to, when you're starting that community sort of planning process, then you need to be introducing that at the same time. So it's not something you'd be looking at down the track. And it's really, and again, this is a real tension which Kirsten really highlighted really nicely around sort of the kind of bureaucratic pressure to plan versus where the community might be at. But as Rob Gordon says, and has said many times, we have to sort of treat people as adults and community members as adults, and they have, they have hopes and aspirations for their communities, and they want to be part of that. So we have to find the way to be able to kind of introduce these concepts into any sort of planning concept.
Thanks, John. And we have one last question I think we have time for from Yvette, and I'll direct this to you, Kirsten, given your experience. Yvette asks, it is proving very difficult in my community to form a well-balanced community-led recovery team. Many people have their own agendas, so how do you make sure the committee is a well-balanced one?
Oh, the joys. I've often said working in community recovery would be much easier without the community, wouldn't it? I think this is one of the things I think even in normal council business, we might have an environmental advisory committee, or we might have a wellbeing or a disability advisory committee, and ensuring that the people who are on those committees are representative of the community is something that we deal with on a daily basis. And I think in recovery, I've been had experience with the community doing their own vote. So they had an election process. They had people who had to nominate. It was available for everybody. They voted in who they wanted on the Community Recovery Committee. And that worked really well for them. And, and in other ones, it was really just whoever put their hand up was there. And you soon, balancing those personal agendas and political agendas becomes really community development 101. I don't really have an answer, but I think it's around making sure that that people understand what that recovery team or recovery committee or association is for, and what the expectations of that recovery committee are. And so if they're not fulfilling that, then the rest of the community has an opportunity to say, hang on a minute, that's not what we said, and that's not what we want. They're sort of accountable to their own community as opposed to being just a committee that council set up because it says we have to do that in the recovery plan. So, I think it's just really around communication and trying to be as open and transparent about who wants to be on that committee and what's expected of them. I don't know if that helps answer the question or not.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good, Kirsten. Look, we're committed with these webinars to make sure that we, close them off within the 60 minutes. We know your time is valuable. So on behalf of everyone who has attended today, and I'd like to thank in particular John and Kirsten for their expertise, It's been a great first recovery webinar for AIDA. We had 142 people online, and this will also be podcasted onto the AIDA Knowledge Hub for people who want to listen afterwards. Before you all dial out, we're really keen to get your insight into future recovery webinar topics. So when you exit this webinar, there'll be a very short survey where you can provide us with your suggestions. So the next webinar will be featuring community-led recovery, so we'll go into more detail on that. We'd also like to cover off on the impacts on education for young people in recovery, the work that Lisa Gibbs has led with the University of Melbourne, and they've got some really good data to inform that. And I think, John, the role of the media in recovery and using the media was something that particularly resonated with me in your presentation. So if you could fill in that survey, that would be great. We'll be sending you a link of the recording of today's webinar. There was a lot of resources available on that previous slide, which I see we've moved on from, that a recovery collection on the Knowledge Hub. There's a recovery handbook, the recovery database. We are actually evaluating the recovery database at the moment, so there's a survey that's out. We'll send you a link to that. And we hope that, you will fill it in for us, even if you haven't used the database. We'd really like to get your insights to that. All those resources in the recovery collection are free to download on the AIDA Knowledge Hub, so please, I encourage you to use them. And thank you very much for your attendance today. We'll send you an EDM to advise you when the next recovery webinar is on, but we anticipate it'll be 2 or 3 weeks' time, subject to presenter availability. So thank you so much for your attention this afternoon. Goodbye.